Hi, everyone. So how are you all? Did you have a good breakfast? So yesterday I was at Bloomberg, basically, and they started off with a little poll, basically, and they said, you know, how many of you sort of came by car? That's it, and about 5% of people came by car, basically, and I think certainly in London, that's it, they must have just got stuck in traffic, frankly. That's it. So my family's actually from Bromsgrove, basically, so it's kind of good to be home. My name is Matthew Griffin. I'm a futurist, but also a strategic advisor. So I started an organization basically called the 311 Institute a little while ago. And the clicker isn't working. Have you got a clicker? Oh, it is working now. There you go. See, clickers, basically, the thing is, I mean, I talk about the future of technology, society, culture, business, all that kind of stuff, and clickers basically are always the most tricky things to get working. So I look at kind of two futures. I look at the next 20 years, and then I look 20 to 50 years out. Now, the reason why I looked at 20 years, basically, is because if you're a multinational, if you're an organization, basically, if you're an investor, typically you want to understand what the next 20 years look like, so short and medium term, basically. If you're a government, though, and I work with all G20 governments, basically I work with 4 prime ministers, as and when, basically, they're actually prime ministering, you want to understand what the next 20 to 50 years look like, because you are building the future of countries. So you're looking at the future of infrastructure, you're looking at the future of energy, agriculture, jobs, skills, employment, and everything else. And in today's uncertain times, basically what we have today basically is we are increasingly moving into a future basically that is not just complex, it's dynamic, it's fast-paced. And from everybody's perspective, what we're ultimately looking for, what we ultimately strive for our own individual selves, basically is security and safety. Financial security basically is one of the biggest worries basically that pretty much everybody has. And that's before we start talking about things like automation, basically investments, disruption. If you have a look at the impact basically that we sort of see across ESG, pensions, healthcare, financial planning, wealth planning, succession planning, and all these kinds of things. Basically, the things that we're starting to see coming down the line, basically, from a futures perspective, is absolutely crazy. From my own perspective, basically, I work with organizations like Legal & General, basically, where we have $1.2 trillion under asset. I also work with private equity and hedge fund organizations. I work with venture capitalists, but I also work with high net worth individuals and ultra high net worth individuals, as well as a whole variety of different investment organizations. And ultimately, basically, when we start having a look at this complex thing that we call the future, there are threats and opportunities. That's never changed. If you go back 100, 200 years ago, basically, there were threats in the future, there were opportunities in the future. If you can see them, you can navigate them, you can get a point of view, and that's what I'll be providing you with. So every single organization basically that I work with is being disrupted. For example, when we have a look at Centrica, we see the move to renewables, and we see the cost of electricity driving to zero. So we'll go through some of these. When you have a look at Samsung and Huawei, they live in permanent crisis mode because they are worried about their own organizations being disrupted. When you have a look at companies like Airbus and BMW, transportation is being disrupted. When you have a look at organizations basically like education, so GEMS, for example, education is being disrupted. Everything is being disrupted, and that has significant impacts basically for us as individuals, us as professionals, but also for us as investors and businesses. So how you view the future is down to you. If you view it as a threat, you're going to probably hide yourself in a hole and cover yourself up. If you see it as an opportunity, though, and there is a huge amount of opportunity, then I would encourage you to explore it further. So this particular chart, if I ask you today, how many of you feel that the pace of change today is faster than it was, say, 10 years ago? Hands up. Okay, so that's most of you. In the interest of fairness, while I'm being blinded, does anyone think that today, basically as a society or as individuals or as a profession or whatever it happens to be, we're moving slower today than we did 10 years ago? Hands up? Pretty much no one. So if I fast forward again, so now the year is 2029, and I ask the same question, do you think that we're going to be moving faster as a society and a profession in 2029 than we are today? Hands up. Okay. Anyone say slower? I don't think anyone's put their hands up again. So from a planning perspective, if you're an organizer, it doesn't really matter whether you're an individual, whether you're an organization, basically whether you're an investment advisor. If things are moving faster today, and they're going to be moving faster in the future, if you have a 10-year plan, it's really a 7-year plan. If you have a 5-year plan, it's really a 3-year plan. Your horizon planning starts changing. And the reason why we see the pace of change accelerating is because of this. If you sort of step back to the 1980s and I ask you what you could do with technology next year that you couldn't do this year, you might have a look at Moore's Law in the 80s, basically say, well, we could probably buy faster computer chips for less money. So we can ingest more information, analyze more information, and with that, we can do X, Y, and Z. However, today, basically, we've got so many different technologies coming through that when you actually ask organizations of any ilk, basically whether they are small one-man bands, basically, or whether they're the world's largest multinational organizations, or whether you ask a government, it doesn't really matter, private or public, increasingly we say, well, what are you doing with 5G? What are you doing with gene editing? What are you doing with quantum computing? What are you doing with artificial intelligence? Are you digitizing and moving your business to the cloud? Are you embracing blockchain? And from a company perspective and an individual perspective, all of a sudden, this starts getting really confusing. And on the one hand, basically, it's difficult to sort of figure out how you're going to future-proof yourself. But when we start having a look at some of the technologies, these are the common technologies that people typically talk about. You know, for example, if you have a look at your profession, people will talk about artificial intelligence. Blockchain might sort of creep in. But frankly, basically, there are many, many more technologies than these. And that's not been lost, basically, on the Fortune 250 CEOs. So in the 1990s, basically, the Fortune 250 CEOs basically got together at a business roundtable in New York and decided that they wanted to put together something called shareholder primacy. This is the foundation of many, basically, investment strategies that we have today, the shareholder first strategy. Recently, basically, all 250 of these Fortune 250 CEOs met in New York again under Jamie Dimon, and 186 of them signed up to end shareholder primacy. So if you think, so increasingly, on the one hand, basically these organizations that have typically been focused on relatively short-term results, whether it's quarterly or whether it's annually or whatever it happens to be, are now realizing that the pace of change that is out there now basically is so fast and furious that they can no longer just plan for the short term or even really the medium term. They've got to start planning for the long term. That has an impact basically on ESG, as well as a whole variety of different things, such as the type of companies that they build. If you have a look at Amazon, for example, Jeff Bezos was famous because he went to Wall Street and said, look, don't expect me to make any profit for 7 years. And Wall Street sat with him. And they sat, and they sat, and they sat, and they sat. And now Amazon is one of the most valuable companies in the world. And it fills basically many portfolios. From a pace of change and from the pace of disruption, though, consider this. And again, this is where we are today. So you'll have seen this chart lots and lots in the past, but it took 75 years for the telephone to be adopted by about 50 million users. Pokemon Go basically took 19 days to be adopted by 50 million users. Recently, Call of Duty took 7 days to be adopted by 100 million users. As all of our industries continue to digitize themselves, as we become more connected as a society, from an investment community perspective, I ask you this. At what point, once I've built my product as an entrepreneur, at what point do I push my product live, and provided I can hit the right levers, change an industry at global scale within a day? So I'll give you an example. Just a funny example. I take a bunch of students, basically I take a $200 smartphone, basically I stick some artificial intelligence basically into this phone. I turn the camera basically into a healthcare device, so I position the camera in front of me, it looks like I'm taking a selfie, and with a 90% accuracy I can test myself for pancreatic cancer while I'm on stage. I combine artificial intelligence with the microphone. I do this, and I can tell whether I have the onset of dementia, PTSD, or depression, or all three, and whether I'm getting the flu, because you sound a little bit different basically when you have the flu. I combine artificial intelligence basically with the accelerometer in the phone. I do this, I can test myself for coronary heart disease. What I do now is I take that digitized application, I shove it onto a smartphone, I put it into, say, a Samsung phone. Samsung sell around 250 million phones a year. I've now just disrupted secondary and some primary healthcare. But I've done it in a day. So how does that affect your investment portfolio, basically, when the thing that you invest in, basically, is king of the hill today, but tomorrow, basically, can be knocked off? When you have a look at the sort of the S&P, for example, it's no secret that the number of S&P companies, basically, that are falling in and coming into the S&P is changing at a faster rate than ever before. And in addition to that, what happens within one industry ultimately ripples across, basically, to every other industry. So, for example, if you have a look at free energy, increasingly, you all use energy. If you have a look at transportation, basically, if you are shipping goods and products about, and we talk about autonomous vehicles, you all end up using them, and so on and so on and so on. Whatever happens in the technology industry, it ripples through everything. If you go and have a conversation, basically, with, for example, a bank, basically, and say, what type of industry are you in? They will say, well, we're a bank, stupid. And then I do feel stupid, because I shouldn't really actually even bother asking the question, because I know the answer already. If I go and ask a retailer and say, what industry are you in? Basically, they will say, stupid. Retail, obviously. When I go and ask the same question, basically, to a technology company like Alibaba, Baidu, Google, whoever it happens to be, even Facebook, basically say, what industry are you guys in? They go, well, stupid. All of them. We're in finance, basically, we're in health, basically, we're in transportation, basically, we're in technology, basically, we're in customer service. And the reason, basically, why they can do that is because they're, as digital businesses, digitization breaks down basically all of the individual barriers basically between individual previously siloed industries. So you can start moving basically between one industry and another basically with much less friction and far fewer barriers to entry than ever before. Now you're accelerating the pace of disruption. So as I sort of mentioned, though, basically when we start talking about how we change every single corner of culture, society, basically, and business, there aren't just kind of 8 interesting technologies basically out there. I track over 400 exponential technologies. There are 180 of them on this starburst. And if you go to the 311 website, you can download this, and there's loads of fun you can have. It's kind of like trivia heaven. But for example, so I'll give you an example basically of how we're already starting to disrupt things. If you have a look at 3D printing, for example, basically, which is number 3 on the advanced manufacturing sort of side, 3D printing and 3D holographic printing is being used by Adidas today. So they create a product, they 3D print it in the back of the store. If part of the portfolios basically that you have invested in basically are reliant on Chinese manufacturing, that disrupts that. If you 3D print products basically in the back of a store, you no longer need to ship them, so the logistics companies basically now start suffering. Similarly, basically, if you are 3D printing products in the back of a store, that retailer basically just shot to profitability like never before, because they can eliminate their entire inventory. So Adidas, Nike, Under Armour, and all those sorts of things basically are using those. And literally, with this particular wheel, you can sort of go through absolutely everything. We have quantum computers coming through, so if you're into risk management and risk modeling, basically quantum computers are 100 million times faster than anything that we've ever seen on the planet. Funnily enough, basically, we also have biological computers coming through, basically from China, basically where we've stored information in bacteria and DNA and then replayed it. If you use Microsoft Azure's platform, you'll be able to store information in DNA from about 2020. So all of this is kind of science fiction-y type stuff, but it's here today. With a lot of the things basically that sort of go around this particular wheel, basically if you make the mistake of thinking basically that these things are far out, that this is science fiction, that this is 20, 30, 40 years' time, quite a lot of it isn't. And increasingly it's impacting a whole variety of different sectors. So for example, if you have a look at the energy sector, when we have a look at, so I work with the board of Centrica, for example, and RWE. When you have a look at solar panels, today solar panels are 17% efficient. The record for silicon solar panels is 27% efficiency. Perscovite solar panels get to 32% energy efficient. If you take a genetically engineered bacteria and you put it into a solar panel, on the one hand, it's really cheap to produce the solar panel, you hit 50%. If you take a weird technology, basically called carbon nanotubes, and you put carbon nanotubes into a solar panel, you get 80% efficient. At what point do we think that fossil fuels basically have a future? So all the global asset managers basically that I speak to, they are pulling tens of billions of dollars basically out of oil and gas. But you step back sort of 10 years ago, if you were a the Norwegian pension fund, for example, and you said, we're going to pull out investment from oil and gas, you'd be nuts. Now, basically, they are fleeing. And you sort of go around. So we've got changes in materials and everything else. But frankly, basically, with this wheel, you step round the wheel, that is your next generation product or service. We've got advances in artificial intelligence, basically in materials, basically in brain-machine interfaces. Even brain-machine interfaces now, we're at the point, basically, where we can stream live movies from people's heads. That's already being used in healthcare for patients who are paralyzed and with ALS syndrome. So if you have locked-in syndrome in a hospital, we can now use a brain-machine interface, combine it with artificial intelligence, and you can stream your thoughts to TV to communicate with your loved ones. So as I say, that's just the tip of the iceberg. But each individual technology on that wheel basically has the ability to either transform and disrupt one industry or all of them. Artificial intelligence is one dot on that wheel. So when we start combining basically with these different technologies and we start looking at what we can actually do, I can disrupt, and we are disrupting every single global industry. So I'm just going to do a snapshot. This is here today, remember, not in the fancy future. So, for example, today, basically, we are told by the United Nations, basically, that in 2050, we will all, the 11 billion people that are on the planet will all be fighting over food and resources, particularly protein. If you take one technology on that wheel, basically it's a bioreactor, it was in the advanced manufacturing sector. If you take a stem cell from an animal, could be a cow, could be a chicken, could be a turkey, could be whatever, and you put that stem cell basically into a bioreactor and you apply some natural hormones, then you do what the cow does naturally. You grow beef that is normally grown within the cow, now in the bioreactor. It's not plant-based burgers that you'll have heard of. It's not artificial meat. It's real meat. 5 years ago, the cost of this stuff basically was about $1 million a pound. It's now $363 a pound. The costs plummet. That's one of the other advantages of technology, depending on which side of the fence you look at. These technologies are now being heavily invested in based by companies like Jeff Bezos. So, for example, if you think Ocado, if you start combining a bioreactor basically with a vertical farm, and Ocado are now investing in vertical farms, when you go and order lettuce in the future basically from Ocado, that lettuce basically won't come from Spain, basically it'll come from a Ocado warehouse. So in about the next 3 to 5 years, basically the cost of this technology basically will get to about $15 or $5 a pound. In the US, the regulator, the FDA, basically have approved clean meat for sale basically in Walmart. So not only do we eliminate 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions because we can get rid of the farting cow, we can actually feed the entire population. China just bought $300 million of this stuff basically from Israel. So I'm showing you some of these industries because some of these industries are probably industries that you don't think can be disrupted. Just to demonstrate. There's a whole conversation with each industry, let alone just these little snippets. When we start talking about communications, basically we have 12,000 low Earth orbit satellites going up now, and those are designed to cover the entire planet, basically with 4G, 5G, and Wi-Fi. So only 3.5 billion people on the planet are connected today. These connect up the other 3.5 billion people. So if you're Disney, and you say, for example, are a Disney shareholder or a Netflix shareholder, this technology doubles your total addressable market opportunity. If you're a digital business, again, it doubles your global total addressable market opportunity. It also brings in a whole new level of cybercrime, and it also brings in a whole new set of competitors, basically when we start talking about automation and the gig economy. Construction. We're at the point basically where we've already 3D printed entire communities down in South America. So 3D printing is what we call an additive technology. It lays things down in layers and then just builds it up. So by 2030, Dubai want 25% of all of their new builds to be 3D printed. In France, we have people living in 3D printed houses. In Holland, we have people living in 3D printed villages. In America, Ukraine, basically in China, basically we are 3D printing more and more buildings. We can also create fully autonomous construction sites. And in Dubai, basically, we've already penned a memorandum of understanding to 3D print an 80-story skyscraper. We are changing how construction in companies build. Energy, I've already described this one. We have a pathway, a low-cost pathway to get solar panels to 80% efficiency. That does a number of things. So think about the number of investment organizations today that are pushing huge amounts of investment into things like lithium-ion batteries. China is spending around $30 billion building out lithium-ion battery factories and everything else. Today, basically, you have an electric vehicle, or tomorrow, but today you have an electric vehicle, basically, it has a queen-size mattress worth of lithium-ion batteries. Firstly, we can wirelessly charge that car, so we can get rid of some of those batteries. So we're using fewer lithium-ion batteries. When we start having a look at things like flexible solar panels, you can put a flexible solar panel basically onto a car. So Hyundai and Toyota and Lightyear one of doing this. And today, we have cars that can be used for everyday purposes. They'll go for an infinite amount of range, basically using solar panels. And they're starting to be sold commercially. So it is going to be much faster for us to switch basically from the combustion engine to lithium-ion. We're going to switch from lithium-ion basically to these other technologies much, much quicker. That also changes basically how you lay out your infrastructure if you're a country, things like supercharger networks and everything else. And from a solar panel, perspective, putting flexible solar panels basically on a car is just an integration issue. From a retail perspective, if you have stocks in Amazon, Amazon in 2020 looks like it'll be the world's first fully autonomous retailer in one slice of their business. They have artificial intelligences that are designing clothes. They're called creative machines. If you go online and you want to order a dress, basically, or a shirt, what these things will do is they will go off, have a look at social media, and figure out basically what a 5-star shirt or a 5-star dress is. What are the dresses basically that everyone likes? Because that's probably quite a decent design. They will take those, they iterate those. Basically, you go onto Amazon's website. Basically, you go and select one. So you push the button on it. You pay for it. That product basically is then made on demand, basically in an Amazon factory. They don't hold any stock whatsoever. They just hold fabric. That product is made basically on demand. It is then fulfilled basically using advanced robots, basically that combine machine vision, artificial intelligence, and dexterous hands that can pick faster than humans. And then it's fulfilled using a drone, an autonomous van, an autonomous vehicle, or whatever it happens to be. Amazon have got every single piece of the jigsaw puzzle that they need to do that lined up now. Same with JD.com. JD.com is one of China's largest e-commerce sites. That disrupts retail again. Also pushes retailers' margins sky high. Transportation basically is being impacted by fully autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles. If you invest basically in an organization basically that doesn't have a self-driving car program, that doesn't have an electric car program, they're probably not going very far. But then similarly, if I went back to 2010 and I went into Mercedes as a futurist and I said, you know what, I have a crystal ball. And in my crystal ball tells me that in 5 or so years' time, basically, you are going to be making cars that drive themselves, that you no longer sell to consumers, because you sell them as a service, and you are going to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars basically on electrification. Audi bought $48 billion worth of lithium-ion batteries, for example, recently. Do you think I'd be kicked out the boardroom? Do you think I'd be a crank or an idiot? I'd be kicked out. Yet here we are. Literally, 5 years later, they're all doing it, let alone 10 years later. 10 years later, basically, they are all at it, everyone on the planet. So when we start talking about basically face-to-face interactions as well, basically there's always this talk of bots and chatbots and everything else. The FCA, by the way, are starting to clamp down based on Robo Advisors, which I think basically is actually quite right, because Robo Advisors basically are typically a black box. We don't necessarily understand how a lot of them work, particularly the more complex ones. We can automate basically anything, really. We can automate any job. People always say, well, you can't automate my job. When you have a look at Goldman Sachs basically are automating the IPO process. We don't automate a job. We automate the tasks of your job. And then we tie all those together, and then we've automated you. So this will come. It already is. So this is actually a AI politician, just for a little bit of fun. Recently, the Chinese ministry, the foreign ministry, created an artificial intelligence, basically, that they take around with them to help them with trade negotiations. So the artificial intelligence will literally go off and assess a particular country's negotiation stance, basically their strengths and weaknesses, and then provide investment advice and negotiating advice, basically, to the Chinese government. However, what we sort of talk about today, basically, is we kind of talk about chatbots. And these chatbots we typically talk about, basically, they're text-based, and you sort of ask them some questions or whatever it happens to be. They will ask you about your risk profile and, attitude to risk and all that kind of stuff. And that's fine, they're cute. But this is the next generation. This is Ava. Ava basically is an avatar, a digital human, basically from a company called Soul Machines in New Zealand. She's being used in customer service for Daimler Chrysler. She's also being used by Royal Bank of Scotland and NatWest to help sell mortgages at the moment, so they're going through a trial. What's special about Ava, basically, is that Ava, you could call her a chatbot, but that would be to do her under. Ava, basically, is one of the most advanced neural network humans on the planet. If you ask her a question, she uses natural language processing and cognitive artificial intelligence to come up, basically, with an answer. She doesn't produce stock answers. And the rate of development, basically, of this particular platform, basically, is staggering. Even to the point now, basically, where we have 5 Fortune 100 CEOs, basically, who are digitizing and immortalizing themselves using this type of technology, so that when they die, the boards of those Fortune organizations can dial them up and say, Jeff, we're thinking about buying a company. What do you think? And Jeff goes, hey, well, you know what? You obviously know that I died 10 years ago. However, based on my experience, if you have a think about the amount of information that's out there just on all of you, we take all of that profile information, we thump it into one of these. Basically, we can take a minute's worth of a YouTube video to imitate your voice, your mannerisms, your actions, your emotions. Basically, we can do all sorts of things. It's crazy. If you kind of think Facebook on steroids, basically, you thump that into this. You now have a Robo Advisor, basically, that you've never, ever seen before. This presents an opportunity. So on the one hand, it's a threat. These are the Robo Advisors that are going to be coming through sooner rather than later. You could either own Ava, and you could actually provide Ava out basically as a subscription service. That's the opportunity. Or, depending on the type of the market basically that you're actually advising, she's a threat, because a subscription model basically will come after you. But now you know, you can navigate it. However, basically from my perspective, when I actually have a look at investment advice, I still think you can't beat a human. And the reason for that is if you think about all the industries that we've just turned upside down and disrupted, let alone anything else, there is not a single artificial intelligence on the planet that can make sense of that. That will come about 2035, 2037 with artificial general intelligence. That's a game changer. But when you start having conversations with people, for example, a lot of the high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals that I talk to, basically, they will never go to a chatbot. They want to talk to you. They want to understand, okay, when you're giving me investment advice, why are you giving me that advice? You can't analyze an artificial intelligence yet. We have something called explainable artificial intelligence coming through, but an AI will just simply say, this is my advice. And when you say, well, why is that your advice? It'll just go, because it is. You can't dig into it. With a human, I can say, I can question your decision-making. I can say, why are you suggesting that and not this? The value, basically, of face-to-face interaction in the future is actually needed more, not needed less. And then from a navigating the maze perspective, because there is so much change, basically from an investment advice perspective, your clients actually now need you more, not less. And I will show you basically when we start talking about succession planning, wealth management planning, and all sorts of things. Because increasingly everything is changing. Now, I'm going to cover this one, and then I'll move on to sort of pensions. Failure of trust. One of the things, basically, I will just urge you to be wary of as we drive, basically, from now, basically, to the next 10 years. Bearing in mind, this is already out. Again, this is out. So this isn't really a future thing, but is a failure of trust. So when you go out and you do your research, today, basically, when you're doing your research into whatever you're researching, you could generally trust the content. This is a artificial intelligence, basically, from a company called OpenAI. Basically, they received $1 billion worth of investment from Microsoft. They have what is being called the world's most dangerous artificial intelligence. This particular platform, you can go and try it. You type a couple of words or a couple of sentences, and the thing basically will then make up the rest of the story for you. So when we start talking about the creation of fake news, fake information, and everything else, this is a staggeringly good platform. And this, again, is the tip of the iceberg, basically, when we talk about synthetic content. Think deepfakes on steroids. However, at the moment, basically, when we start talking about the democratization of content and creativity, if I wanted to create a fake video, at the moment, I would typically either need deepfake technology, I would need artificial intelligence experts, I would need some people who know about rotoscoping, I'd need a bit of a team, frankly. These are starting to come through. So with this particular one, this is from Stanford and Princeton, this is where you just type. So you type the video that you want to create. Create a fake viral video, basically, of Donald Trump announcing war on North Korea. Send. This technology, basically, is still relatively nascent, but if you consider this with deepfake technology, 3 years ago, deepfake technology basically was in a Stanford lab. If you wanted to create a deepfake video, basically, of a politician saying something that they shouldn't, you needed generally about 5 to 6 artificial intelligent neural network experts, basically, who are typically paid about $1 to $1.5 million a year. You would need access to huge amounts of computing power. And then at that point, you'd produce a deepfake video where people looked at it and went, yeah, that's cute, but that's fake. Now, I take a phone, I download an app called Zhao, basically from China. I do this with my face. I then click the Leonardo DiCaprio video that I want to appear in, and I just go, I'll have that one, thank you. And it will now put my face over Leonardo DiCaprio, and I can now email that to my friends. So we have gone from bleeding edge research to it's free in an app in 3 years. The pace of acceleration when we start talking about our ability to create fake news, fake content is accelerating, so just be careful of it. Now, from a retirement perspective, basically, so pension planning, succession planning, with some of the guys basically I talk to, what happens basically when you are doing family succession planning, and as an individual, you want to figure out the best way to leave things to your children or to your grandchildren? What happens when your children and or your grandchildren don't live to 80? What happens when they start living to 100, to 150? What happens basically when you push beyond that? So we already have technologies coming through. And again, this is just a very, very fine slice. So I've just shown you this demonstration. I can use a smartphone, basically, and I can do all sorts of things. So, for example, I can check myself on stage, basically, for a heart attack. I'm fine. But if I'm not, basically, I can get an early warning diagnosis. I can go to the hospital or can call someone. I can call a GP up, basically, on the phone. So when we start talking about preventative medicine, wearables like this, they're taking huge amounts of biometric data, and they're starting to say, you're getting ill, you're stressed, whatever it happens to be, and they're sending information back. So when we start talking about mental health and physical wellness, basically we've got lots of different easy, cheap ways basically to track basically how well we're doing. And those only get better in the future. In addition to that, though, basically if you get hit, unfortunately, by a car, today, basically, if you have a heart attack, if you get hit by a car or whatever it happens to be, typically you need to wait for somebody else basically to die so that you can have their organs. We are already 3D printing human organs. You can actually replace about 70% of the human body today, and over the next 10 years, basically they'll start pushing to about 85%. So we already have people, and again, this is a big topic by itself, but we already have organizations basically that have 3D printed human hearts that are this big. Functional human hearts, and then they get this big and this big and this big. But we also have organizations that are 3D printed artificial human skin, bone, cartilage, tissue, brain tissue, and everything else. So when you go into hospital in the near future, the NHS is already using these technologies as well. If you suffer cancer and you've ended up having to have some of your bones taken out or whatever because they've become cancerous, they can literally take your stem cells, like we did with the cow, they can take your stem cells and then 3D print you a new bone. But it's not an artificial bone, it's your own bone. So when we start having a look at basically how we can produce artificial organs basically that have zero chance of rejected because they're based on your own DNA, these are being used today. And then we accelerate up and out. So now start thinking about from a succession planning perspective where you go, so, Mr. Client, Mrs. Client, when you die, basically in 30 to 40 years, how would you like to carve up your estate? Does this change basically how you do wealth management planning and all that kind of stuff? Oh, by the way, we've seen a bunch of new technologies. Basically, you might not die in 40 years. You might actually die in 60. Oh, and by the way, basically, your health, basically, you'll be in relatively good health, basically, until you're 80, not 60. Design of humans. Basically, we had a Chinese researcher recently, basically, that used a gene editing technology called CRISPR to snap the telomeres, basically, off two twins. And he got severely reprimanded and pretty much put in jail for this because it's illegal, but nevertheless, the technology is still there. Ethics, regulations slow some of this stuff down. But what he fundamentally did, basically, is he managed to edit the genome of these particular twins, basically, so they can never get HIV. We've already done it, basically, to rats and mice and bacteria, basically, where we've genetically engineered relatively complex mammals, so they are literally immune to every single pathogen on the planet because viruses replicate in a particular way. That's a different story. In vivo gene editing, basically, if you are born with an inherited genetic disease today, something like Hunter's syndrome, so for example, you're sitting down with someone with an inherited genetic disease or their family basically has an inherited genetic disease. If you had Hunter's syndrome and you went to a doctor and you say, okay, what have I got? The doctor would actually traditionally say, I have good news and I have bad news for you. And they'd sort of go, oh, okay. What's the good news? And the doctor will go, the good news is that you'll die. And they go, that doesn't sound very good. They go, blimey, if that's the good news, what's the bad news? And they go, well, the bad news is that you'll die very, very painfully. That's what Hunter's syndrome does. We took a gene editing technology, put it into an intravenous drip, put a patient with Hunter's syndrome basically in bed for about an hour, fed this saline solution into him with this gene editing tool. Basically, it found the faulty gene, clipped the faulty gene out, clipped the new one in. It's called in vivo gene editing. He no longer has Hunter's syndrome. And basically, and this was about a year ago, all indications are basically that he's actually recovering very, very well, basically, and he doesn't have it. So now does he live for 20 years or does he live for 30 or 40? And then when we start having a look at service delivery, for example, increasingly, basically, we've got organizations like Ross AI and law geeks, basically, that are automating back office law. So JP Morgan recently used what we call robo lawyers, basically, to automate 400,000 man-hours of work. When we have a look at new narratives, there are lots and lots of different conversations that you can have with your clients, basically, that your competitors might not. Because your competitors are still having a look at the world, basically, through a traditional lens. And then when we start having a look at new ideas, increasingly, basically, as we start digitizing basically everything, basically we have more and more access to more and more information basically on our clients. Basically, we can do a whole variety of new services, but we can also hyper-personalize basically those services from them. So there's a huge number of conversations. Oh, and by the way, this was generated by an artificial intelligence. So when I talk about the future of synthetic content and everything else and being able to trust it, these are high-definition images, basically, from a general adversarial network called NVIDIA. So when you start looking at things, basically, when we start having a look at things like ESG, from an ESG perspective, an environmental perspective, we have a way to eliminate 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We can change to renewables. Basically, that's 40% of greenhouse gases gone. We can use green concrete. That's 10% gone. We can electrify the transportation and airline industries. That's another 20% gone. When we have a look at ESG investing, basically, typically there's a whole flow there. We also have the end of shareholder primacy coming. When we have a look at wealth and succession planning, basically what happens basically when you live longer. If you don't think that you're going to live longer, I have a whole conversation basically for you. There are many, many technologies that are coming through today. If you think basically from a biotech perspective or from a healthcare perspective, a lot of these treatments are going to take years or decades to come through, generally you'll be wrong. The FDA used to take 7 years to identify and then authorize basically a new drug. They are now authorizing new artificial intelligence drugs basically in 6 months. So the speed of change is accelerating. So that's it really from me. I'd like to thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. I hope you found that interesting. There's lots of conversations that you can have. There's lots of change, but there's lots of opportunity. Look at it as an opportunity, not a threat. But as I mentioned, with all of this craziness basically that's sort of coming through, you now have even more of an opportunity to drive more value basically for yourselves, basically in your clients, basically in ways that you'd never necessarily expected. And your clients need you more now to understand all of this, to pick it all apart, basically, and tell them what it means for them and their particular plans or their wants or desires or whatever it is than ever before. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the day.